So you ever find yourself wondering about the why people do things?
Yeah, like especially when those actions cross a line.
Right.
Could be small, could be serious crime.
Exactly. What's the thinking behind it? It feels, fundamental. And today we're really diving into one of the first big answers, classical theory.
It's a great starting point. For ages, this has been a huge puzzle. In classical theory, it offers this initial idea that crime isn't just random.
Okay.
It suggests it's more like a calculation, maybe a flawed one, but still a calculation. The core idea is people are rational, they have free will,
Uh-huh.
and they weigh the potential rewards against the potential penalties. It all kind of hinges on seeking pleasure and avoiding pain.
Right, that pleasure pain idea. That sounds a lot like Jeremy Bentham, doesn't it? Was he involved here?
Oh, absolutely. Bentham's thinking was, well, massive. His whole philosophy stressed this kind of calculus,
Yeah.
pleasure versus pain driving what we do.
And that became key for the classical take on crime.
Yeah.
Exactly, a cornerstone. So let's make it concrete. Imagine Joe, university student, maybe hanging out at Union Station.
Okay.
He sees someone asleep, food court maybe, and their wallet, full of cash, is right there. Easy target.
Yeah, tempting. Definitely a moment where you'd think twice.
So from the classical view, what's happening in Joe's mind?
He's weighing it up.
Pretty much, running a mental balance sheet. On one side, the good stuff, maybe that coat he wants, a nice dinner out.
The potential benefits.
Right. And on the other side, the potential costs getting caught, court, maybe people finding out, embarrassment.
Social consequences.
Yeah. And classical theory basically says his decision, take it or leave it, depends on which side feels, well, heavier in that moment.
This whole rational choice thing, it feels like it must have older roots, right? Not just something cooked up recently.
Oh, definitely not. The basic idea of free will, choosing our actions. Philosophers have debated that since ancient Greece, wrestling with how much control we really have.
And even later, you had thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard questioning if pure rationality was really the only thing driving us.
But applying it specifically to crime, that came later.
Right, that really came together during a specific time, the post-Enlightenment, 17th century Europe, a period of huge change.
Massive upheaval, yeah.
Exactly. Big shifts happening politically, power moving away from monarchs more towards like the marketplace, capitalism rising.
Society was restructuring itself.
And socially, too.
Yeah.
How people understood laws, norms, common law was gaining ground over just, what the king said.
So a move away from the old ways of explaining things.
Totally. The Enlightenment itself was challenging all those supernatural explanations for, well, everything, including behavior.
Right.
There's this huge emphasis on human agency,
Yeah.
The idea that we can reason, make choices. Thinkers like Descartes, Locke, Newton, Kant, Goethe, Voltaire, Rousseau.
Big names, all feeding into this climate of reason and individual will.
Exactly. And right in the middle of that, 1764, Cesare Beccaria publishes On Crimes and Punishments.
That feels like a really pivotal moment for criminology.
It was absolutely groundbreaking. He just ripped into the justice systems of the time, often random, way too cruel. His big argument was, punishment shouldn't be about revenge. It's primarily about stopping future crime, prevention.
And that ties straight back to rational choice, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If people weigh costs, punishment ups the cost.
Perfectly put. Beccaria saw it clearly. Increase the perceived costs for a rational person, and you can deter them. That's deterrence theory in a nutshell.
Simple idea, but powerful.
But he was nuanced about it. He wasn't just saying punish harder. He stressed that for it to work, punishment had to be swift.
Quick?
Certain, so people knew it was coming.
Uh-huh.
And just severe enough. Enough to link the act and the consequence clearly in that rational person's head, not excessive.
Fascinating. And these ideas actually had a huge impact, didn't they? You mentioned the legal system.
Oh, massive impact. Classical theory really influenced reforms all over Europe, Italy, England. Its fingerprints are on the French Penal Code of 1791. And even on basic principles in the U.S. Constitution from 1787, it fundamentally changed how people thought about justice.
But like any big theory, it wasn't perfect. People started poking holes in it, right? This idea of perfect rationality.
It became a major criticism, yeah. Criminologists started saying, hang on, does everyone really do this careful calculation every time?
It seems unlikely.
Right. Not all crime looks like a well-thought-out cost-benefit analysis. People act on impulse, out of strong emotion, maybe under the influence.
Themes that mess with rational thinking.
Exactly. None of that fits neatly into a purely rational model.
Thinking about Joe at the station again, If he was, say, going through a messy divorce, really upset.
Or maybe he'd just come from a party, had a few too many tequilas.
Right. That rational calculator might just, shut down.
Precisely. Emotional distress, intoxication.
Hmm.
They seriously mess with rational decision-making. And critics also pointed out, how do you even measure these costs and benefits objectively?
Good point.
Like, how do you weigh the thrill of stealing against, say, feeling guilty later? Or the chance of getting caught?
It's trying to put numbers on feelings, almost. Very subjective.
Exactly. So these issues, plus a broader intellectual shift in the late 1800s, meant classical theory started to lose ground.
To something else.
Yeah, to what's called positivism. Positivists moved away from free will and rationality. They looked at other factors.
Like biology, environment.
Exactly. Biology, psychology, social conditions. They thought maybe criminals weren't really choosing in the same way. Maybe forces beyond their control were at play.
Which would change how you approach punishment, right?
Totally. The focus shifted more towards rehabilitation, trying to fix the underlying issues rather than just deterring through punishment.
Okay, so classical theory fades a bit, positivism rises. But then you mentioned neoclassical theory emerging later. What happened?
Well, positivism and the whole rehabilitation focus, they ran into their own problems by the 1960s. It was a really turbulent period, socially, politically, and people started questioning whether the state could effectively rehabilitate everyone, or if maybe the focus should be elsewhere. There were debates from all sides, really.
And wasn't there that famous article, Martinson, the nothing works idea?
Ah, yes. Robert Martinson's article in the mid-70s, it had a huge impact, even though he later, sort of, walked back the very strong nothing works conclusion.
But it stuck.
It definitely fueled skepticism about rehabilitation programs. It added to this growing feeling that maybe the focus should go back towards, well, punishment and deterrence. It helped open the door for classical ideas to come back in the 80s.
But not just a straight copy of the old theory. This is where neoclassical comes in.
Correct. Neoclassical theory didn't just ignore the criticisms, it tried to incorporate them. It still starts with rational choice, cost-benefit, but it acknowledges that, hey, people aren't perfectly rational calculators all the time.
And that's where people like Clark and Cornish came in, with bounded rationality.
Exactly. Mid-80s, they introduced this key idea, bounded rationality. Basically, your ability to be perfectly rational is limited or bounded.
Limited by what?
All sorts of things. How much information you actually have, your own thinking skills, how much time you've got.
The situation itself.
Yeah, like maybe you have a splitting headache or you don't realize there's a camera right there. Or even bigger things like maybe you never got a decent education, limiting your legitimate options.
So it's like rational choice, but within limits. More realistic, maybe?
That's the idea. Trying to make a rational calculation, but within this messy reality of constraints and limited knowledge.
And deterrence theory got a boost too, but maybe a more refined version.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Thinkers like Gary Becker brought deterrence back into focus, but the neoclassical view was smarter about it.
How so?
Well, they distinguished between specific deterrence, stopping one offender from doing it again, and general deterrence, scaring off the wider public.
Okay, two different targets.
Right. And they also understood better how people perceive costs and benefits.
Yeah.
It's not just the actual punishment.
It's what you think the punishment is.
Exactly. Your perception of the risk or how severe you think the penalty is, that can be way more powerful than the objective reality.
Makes sense.
And they also looked much more closely at extra-legal consequences.
Meaning, like, not the cops, but...
Yeah, stuff like what your friends will think, disappointing your family, losing respect in the community.
The social costs again?
Right. And some research suggests those informal things, like worrying about your mom finding out. That can actually be a stronger deterrent for some people than the official punishment, like getting a ticket.
Interesting. So we have the theory, it's evolution.
Mm-hmm.
How does it stack up when we evaluate it? Let's start with the internal logic. Does it make sense on its own terms?
Well, yeah, within its own bubble, it's pretty logical. If you accept the starting points, people are rational, free will, driven by pleasure pain.
Then crime happens when the good outweighs the bad.
Exactly. And swift, certain, proportionate punishment should tip the scales back. It hangs together logically if you accept those initial assumptions.
But the if is the big part, right? Where does the logic wobble when you hit the real world?
That's where it gets tricky. It really does oversimplify how complex we are. Human behavior isn't just about rational calculation.
There's more going on.
So much more. Social factors, psychological stuff, the structures we live in. The theory kind of glosses over those. Think about crimes that just don't seem rational on the surface,
Right.
like a schoolyard fight right in front of a teacher, or shoplifting something cheap when you know there are cameras everywhere, or someone trapped in addiction who keeps using despite awful consequences. Doesn't always look like a neat calculation.
And the logic of deterrence itself, even if the basic idea sounds okay.
It has limits, too. It kind of assumes everyone responds to the threat of punishment in the same way.
Which we probably don't.
Right. People differ hugely in impulse control, what they need right now, their social situation, whether they even have good alternatives to crime.
Hmm.
And also, let's be honest, most people follow the law most of the time for reasons other than just being scared of getting caught.
Like morality. Or just not wanting to.
Exactly. Morality, empathy, maybe just no opportunity or desire to commit that crime anyway. Fear of punishment is only one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so the pure logic has some issues. What about the evidence? Does research actually support classical ideas?
Well, the research picture is mixed, let's put it that way.
Not a simple yes or no.
Definitely not. Some studies, especially on property crimes, suggest offenders do think about the games. What's the stuff worth versus the risk?
Okay, so some support there.
But those decisions often seem really quick, based on bad info, not
Yeah.
well planned out, which actually sounds more like that bounded rationality we talk about, not perfect calculation.
Right, rationality with limits. And are the benefits always just about money or things?
Great question. No, not at all. Research shows robbers, for instance, might be thinking about releasing tension, expressing anger, maybe even gaining status in their group.
Stuff that's hard to measure against jail time.
Exactly. How do you rationally weigh feeling less frustrated against 5 years in prison? It complicates that simple cost-benefit idea.
What about the big picture studies, comparing punishment levels and crime rates?
Again, it's nuanced. Some quantitative research finds maybe a slight negative link, like maybe super high punishment levels correlate with slightly lower crime rates sometimes.
No, but it's not a strong effect.
Generally not the main driver.
Right.
Other things like economic conditions or social factors usually seem way more important in explaining crime rate changes.
Okay.
And importantly, research also shows not everyone is even deterrable in the same way. Some criminologists talk about deterrable offenders, but also acute conformists, people who don't offend anyway.
Right.
And incorrigible offenders who just don't seem bothered by the threat of punishment much at all.
So deterrence doesn't work the same for everyone. A one-size-fits-all punishment strategy might miss the mark.
That seems to be the case. And some research even suggests just making punishments harsher doesn't always lower crime. Sometimes it might even backfire.
How could it backfire?
Well, think about the strain it puts on people, the stigma. Getting locked up can make it harder to get a job, maintain relationships, potentially pushing people towards more crime in the long run.
And does an experience with the system change things?
Yeah, there's the experiential effect. Some studies suggest that the more someone gets involved with the justice system, the less they might actually fear getting caught again. Familiarity breeds contempt, maybe.
Or they learn how to navigate it.
Possibly. And there's even some evidence for an emboldening impact, where, paradoxically, surviving punishment might make some individuals more likely to reoffend, not less. It's complex.
So if the evidence is so mixed and the logic has holes, why is classical theory still so important? What's its practical value or legacy?
Well, despite all that, its influence on actual crime policy has been enormous. Think about the whole tough-on-crime era in the U.S. starting in the 70s.
Driven by deterrence ideas.
Hugely. It fueled policies like cutting back parole, introducing mandatory minimum sentences, arguing for capital punishment, all based on the idea that making punishment harsher and more certain would scare people straight.
And 3 strikes laws fit right into that, don't they?
Prime example.
Yeah.
Lock up repeat offenders for a very long time. The consequence. A massive, truly staggering increase in the prison population in the U.S.
With huge costs, presumably.
Immense financial costs, yeah. Maintaining all those prisons, housing all those people. By late 2013, the numbers in state and federal prisons were just astronomical.
You also brought up scared straight programs earlier, another deterrence attempt.
Right, from the 70s, too. The idea was simple. Take young people, show them the grim reality of prison, and scare them off crime.
There was that famous documentary, right? Rawway Prison.
That's the one. Got a lot of attention. Seemed like a plausible idea, maybe?
But did it actually work? What did the research find later?
Not really. Follow-up studies pretty consistently found that the kids who went through Scared Straight didn't commit less crime than similar kids who didn't.
Oh.
In fact, sometimes they did worse, and many participants were low-risk kids anyway. So it casts serious doubt on that specific tactic.
But the general idea of deterrence didn't just disappear.
No, the broader appeal of neoclassical thinking, focusing on punishment and individual choice, remained pretty strong in policy circles, even if specific programs like Scared Straight didn't pan out.
Okay, so wrapping this up then. Classical theory was clearly a massive shift, moving away from magic or demons.
Absolutely. Towards ideas about individual responsibility, rational choice, and the role of the state in managing behavior through law and punishment.
It really laid the groundwork for modern criminal justice systems, in many ways universal laws, holding individuals accountable.
Definitely. And even though the original version had flaws, it evolved into neoclassical theory, trying to account for things like bounded rationality. It shows an ongoing attempt to understand that cost-benefit calculation.
But we absolutely have to keep the criticisms in mind, the risk of seeing people as too rational.
Yeah, ignoring all the other pressures, social, economic, psychological.
And the research. It's not exactly a slam dunk for deterrence being the main answer.
No, it's much more complicated than that. And the real-world results of policies based purely on severe punishment.
Hmm.
Well, we see things like mass incarceration, which raises huge questions.
Absolutely. Understanding the strengths and the very real weaknesses here seems critical if we want to think about, better ways to handle crime, more effective, more just approaches.
Couldn't agree more. It's an ongoing challenge.
So, as you think about everything we've unpacked today, here's something to chew on. What does our understanding of why people commit crimes, whether it's rational choice, something else, or a mix, really mean for how we should respond? Is focusing mainly on deterrence, on making the costs higher, enough? Or do we fundamentally need to address those deeper underlying factors that influence behavior in the first place? Maybe think about some crimes you hear about. Try looking at them through that classical lens. Where does rational choice seem to fit, and where does it just feel incomplete? It's a huge question, and the debate definitely isn't over.